Welcome to Power Lunch Live. I'm Rhett Power, your host. Good to be with you here in March 2021. I cannot believe we are in March already. That's just crazy to me. We're almost a year into the pandemic, and I remember thinking, wow, this will be over in a few months and we'll get back to normal, but here we are. The point of Power Lunch Live is to have today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, and people who are making a huge difference in the world, making an impact, and doing great work that we can learn from in our daily lives and in our daily work. Now, the fun part about the show is that it is interactive. The way that happens, though, is if you get on your device, your computer, whatever it is you use, and send us a message during the show. Now, we broadcast on LinkedIn Live, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and a couple other platforms I'm not even aware of. And we monitor those during the show so that you can actually get to the questions you want answered. And so please do send us those questions. That's a fun part of this show. But it depends on you to make that happen. Now, today is going to be incredible. We have got a researcher, professor, author, and a fellow MG Marshall Goldsmith 100 coach, Dr. Marilyn Gist. She's got a new book out called The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility and Thriving Organizations and Great Results. That's just coming. It's just out, right, Marilyn?
It's been out a few months, just a few months.
Right. And so we're going to have a great conversation around that. Her work has garnered over 12,000 citations. She's a Howard University grad with years teaching at the University of Washington and Seattle University. And she started her academic career at the University of North Carolina, which I'm a little disappointed in because I went to the real Carolina, which is South Carolina. But we won't get into that debate.
Okay.
And the University of Washington, where she's held the Boeing Endowed Professorship of Business Management, and Seattle University, where she served as Associate Dean and Professor of Management and Executive Director of the Center of Leadership Formation. Welcome. It's good to have you today.
Thank you so much, Rhett. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we're going to have some fun. This is just such an important topic that I had to have you on when you sent me the book, and I do appreciate that. You talk about, in the book, leadership as being a relationship. What do you mean?
Well, it's interesting because we think about strategy and goals and return on investment when we think of leaders, particularly top leaders. But at the very start of it, you have to realize leaders work with and through other people. They're not individual contributors. They're really trying to organize a group of people to accomplish whatever those goals are. And you have relationships as a leader with so many different groups of people. You've got employees, you've got customers, you've got maybe other departments or divisions, so your peer group, you've got maybe senior management boards, you've got regulators, you've got community activists. There's the whole gamut of different groups that you have a relationship with. And each one of those could be good or bad or sort of neutral. Right. But the nature of the relationship will influence how well people can work together to accomplish whatever it is that we need to do. So I think we need to bring our awareness back to this issue that fundamental to leadership is relating to other people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But that begs the question, your book is The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility. What is humility? I think it's a question that I've always kind of wondered about, and what does it really look like? Because I think I've seen it, but I've also seen people who weren't genuine about it.
Right. So I am defining specifically leader humility, and I think you could maybe make an extension to personal humility, but I'm defining it really as feeling and displaying a deep regard for others' dignity. And dignity is your sense of self-worth. And we all have that. We all have and need a sense of self-worth. And, in the book, I talk about what goes into that, and I could share a little of that if you like. But coming at it from the perspective of leadership, because leaders are in all these different relationships, essential to any healthy relationship is supporting the other person's sense of self-worth, their dignity. So if I'm a boss, for example, and I've got issues with your performance, I need to talk to you about that in terms of the job and what the expectations are, and not talk about it in a way that's going to cut into who you are as a person, make you feel that there's something wrong about you as an individual. If I step all over your dignity, I'm not going to motivate you. I've actually caused you to pull back. And that's true in any relationship that leaders have. Again, thinking about all these different stakeholder or constituent groups.
That's really important, because I think sometimes, I mean, how do we structure our conversation so that it doesn't have that opposite effect that you're talking about? I mean, how do you, that's a skill not to do that.
It's a skill. It's a set of behaviors that can be learned. But I think it has to begin with understanding that whoever you're talking to, you're seeing that person on the outside, and there's a lot of layers underneath. So I almost think of each of us as having kind of a backpack of our whole life experiences, the perspectives we bring to things. And in that process, we're standing there talking to each other, often without knowing, what's in that. And so the way a leader needs to come to the relationship, I think, is with an openness, a curiosity, withholding particularly negative judgments about things that could be personal qualities or personal characteristics, particularly characteristics that people didn't have a choice about. So if you think of, say, somebody who's got a disability that, they were born with or whatever, it's not being patronizing to respect that and honor that, and to make sure that you're not speaking to a person in a way that sort of, trivializes their experience or is very negative about it. And I think that would be true of many things. We hear people talk about identity politics, but what we're really looking at is the fact that in a mixed world like we have, a mixed country, a mixed workforce, you have people whose background is very different. And the things that go into their sense of who I am and what's important to me are going to be different from person to person.
Yeah, and I think it's incumbent upon you to ask a lot of questions, right?
Yeah.
When you're digging it, when you're trying to figure something out or figure out an issue.
And understanding that none of us knows everything. We can't know everything about everybody. So we're all learners, right? We're all in this together in this process of understanding other people's experience. But leaders with humility are okay with the fact that they don't know everything. And I think that's one of those initial differences is if you have humility, you recognize your strengths and your weaknesses, the fact that you don't know everything and you can't know everything about every person. So you come to that relationship with an openness and a curiosity. And if you stumble on something where someone says, ouch, I mean, it's not really that different than if you bump into someone, you say, oh, excuse me, so if I bump into your dignity, it's okay for me to say, oh, I'm sorry. Can you help me understand more about that? So, I can appreciate it, not make that mistake again, whatever it is. So part of humility, I think, is having that openness to learning.
And it's also that self-awareness, right?
Does take self-awareness. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a critical part to understanding and getting that somebody's not comfortable or reading that in their body language so, I mean, it seems like a really critical element of that.
It is. And it's particularly true because leaders have power over many of the people they're interacting with. They have the power to hire or fire or write performance evaluations, influence pay and compensation, give work assignments that are fun and nice maybe, or those that are more difficult, recommend people for promotions. I mean, they have all sorts of power, and I'm talking organizational leaders, but certainly you could look at leaders in other contexts and take apart what kinds of power do they have? So when you're working with people who have less power, I sort of think of it as they see a big P on your forehead for power. You don't see it, but if you say something that hits at their dignity, you're probably going to see it non-verbally before you hear it verbally. They're going to feel it, and they're going to start withdrawing. And going back to this issue of leading being a relationship, if you violate other people's dignity, you've kind of lost their best effort. You might get away with doing that once or twice, but if they start to see you as someone who doesn't respect their dignity overall, then they're going to start phoning it in. They'll come in maybe and do what they have to do, but you're never going to get their best effort. They're not going to go the full distance for you. And that's why we see such differences in performance in organizations whose leaders are more humble than organizations where they're not.
Yeah, I imagine there's a huge correlation there, and I'd love to dig into that a little bit at some point. But in chapter 4, which I was really blew me away, you were talking about in the book a balanced ego. Can you talk about that a little bit and what that
Sure.
what that is and what that means?
So one of the interesting things about humility, as I'm defining it, is this tendency to feel and display regard for others' dignity. So it's a relationship piece. Whereas some people confuse the idea of humility, in some other contexts with meekness or lowliness. And so they would say, well, that's not appropriate for leaders. And indeed, it really isn't. So we don't think of meekness as a good quality for leaders. On the other hand, we don't think of arrogance, most of us don't, as a good quality of leaders. It's very self-focused, maybe boastful, maybe not able to recognize weaknesses or mistakes. So arrogance gets in the way of others' dignity, and meekness is perhaps too weak or not strong enough. So in balanced ego, what we're really looking for is what I call vital confidence. It's a confidence, meaning you're comfortable with your strengths, you're comfortable leading people, you believe that you have what it takes to be a leader. You also are okay with your weaknesses. So you have that basic confidence to make decisions and do the job, but without straying into arrogance or being too meek and reluctant to speak up and express your direction and your views. So that's really important that leaders understand you can and should be confident, and you can and should be humble. You should have humility. Those are not mutually exclusive.
So self-confidence is not bad. It is actually
not at all. It's desirable.
It's essential to humility.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. I think that's the tough balance. I think that's hard to strike, maybe, because I mean, because I think a lot of us struggle with being vulnerable. Right. And so how do you, when you talk to leaders and you're working with leaders, what's the conversation around vulnerability and humility, and how do you get people to feel comfortable being vulnerable? Because that's what to me, that's what humility is a little bit.
Well, I think humility is a little different than vulnerability. It's not mutually exclusive. But by keeping it really behavioral, I'm talking about showing regard for your dignity. So I don't have to reveal everything about myself. I do need to be able to recognize my weaknesses and my mistakes, because if I can't, then I'm stepping on your dignity. If you're counting on me to do something and I make a goof, and I need to cover that up and pretend like I'm the leader, I know it all, I never make mistakes. Well, you know better. And if it had an impact on you, you're not going to feel very good about that. So your dignity is affected by my inability to do that, for example. So in that sense, I think leaders do have to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know everything. And if I pretend I know everything, we're putting the whole organization at risk, because there are probably a lot of people who have knowledge about certain things that's greater than mine, and I need to be able to bring them into the fold and work with them effectively.
Mm-hmm.
But the real part of humility, as I'm talking about it, is more of, I talk about a set of 6 keys or 6 behaviors that really help answer 3 broad questions people have. So whenever you think about a new leader coming in, or, we have recently newly elected president, or a new boss in an organization, there's 3 things people immediately begin to wonder, Rhett, and one of those is, who are you? I know your
Right.
name, but what are you really made of? What kind of person are you? And then where are we going? What are you going to ask me to do? And how challenging is that going to be? And how much do I have to really relearn things or change the way I'm accustomed to operating? So we all kind of want to know, where are we going? And then the third question is, do you see me? Do you know who I am and what my needs and my interests are? Or am I just a cog in the wheel for you? And so one of the fun things about this study of humility is that whether they know it or not, in their actions and their words, leaders are continually providing answers to those 3 questions. So who I am as a person, your listeners are already getting some sense of that. And they're probably getting it around, a couple of main things. One of those is this balanced ego that we talked about. Am I coming across as really arrogant, know-it-all, or am I coming across as maybe too meek and weak, or somewhere in the middle, that vital confidence I talked about? So that those are the kinds of things that people are looking for when it comes to direction. Where are we going? It's about the vision leaders are setting and the strategies that they ask us to follow, and whether those things are ethical or whether they're shady. That has a lot to do with my comfort with what you're asking me to do. I once had a boss who was asking me to do something that was flatly illegal. I had left working for the federal government to go to private industry, and we were bidding on a contract, and it was getting close to the wire, and the numbers weren't looking so good for us. And, when I was asked to do something, I said, well, that's actually illegal. And I'm the one whose signature had to go on this bid, and I could go to jail for it.
Yeah.
His response to me was, well, don't forget who's paying your check now. Don't forget what side of the bread the butter's on. And it was just very stunning to me that I was being asked to do something that was unethical, illegal. And that hit my dignity, because I'm a pretty ethical person. Those values are deep in me. It's how I was raised. And so I think ethical strategies is a part of this. And then when it comes to do you see me, a lot of people find that that's the most important one. I think it depends on who they're working for. But the way in which leaders include people and develop people has a lot to do with saying, yes, I see you as a human being. And so I talk about generous inclusion. And, Rhett, we hear a lot about inclusion in the context of diversity and equity and inclusion. And it certainly relates to that. But I mean it much more broadly. I'm thinking of all of those different constituent groups we talked about earlier, your suppliers and your customers and your board and your regulators. All of those people are affected by what you're doing, or they can be. So when you're leading and you're making a decision, you need to draw the boundary very broadly so that it includes the concerns and the needs of all of those people. And a lot of times what you'll hear is people will backlash, they'll get upset, and they'll say, well, no one talked to me about this, or you didn't talk to members of my group about this, and you've made a policy or a decision that's just going to leave us, way behind or out in the dark, or, you passed some benefit and we didn't even know about it. We could have been taking advantage of that for the last 8 months, but nobody communicated it to us. And so sometimes we get our blinders on and we're trying to solve a particular problem or meet a goal. And we don't realize that there's a wider range of people who are going to be impacted by that. And so we need to, as I say, draw the boundary more broadly and include those people. And that certainly doesn't mean that, you need to hold a town hall meeting with thousands of people at every turning point. But when you're making a decision that is likely to have an impact, particularly a negative impact on one of these constituent groups, I think it is really important, at least to kind of figuratively pick up the phone or ask for a meeting and discussion with them and really listen to get their input and process that. Is there a way you can amend the decision so that it takes into account the broader good? And a lot of times you can.
Yeah, I agree. I think that communication piece is just so vital.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with it in one of my coaching engagements right now, where that communication is the missing link. But you're absolutely right. I was thinking about that as you were talking about, how that could be an issue. And so, that kind of begs the question then, about culture, and maybe this is an unfair question, but how can you instill humility in your leadership team, and at the same time build a culture of humility? I mean, and is that even possible?
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes, with a small caveat. Back to the self-awareness you mentioned. In the book, I talk about how humility can be developed, and I think it can in probably 85% of folks or more. But there's two prerequisites. One is they have to be interested in learning it. It's hard to teach something to someone who says, "I don't care. I don't think it's important. I'm not interested." Not a good start for learning. And the other is they have to have a reasonable sense of self-awareness. And I do think many, if not most people do, if they want to pay attention to that. So if you have those two things, yes, you can build this in a leader. You can build this culture. One of the things we've just come out with is a set of assessment tools, in fact, that will allow people to get a good benchmark on where they are on these 6 keys compared to, a norm pool of leaders. But the other thing, so then you can build coaching and training around that. But the other thing that's important in organizations is who's the person at the top? Does that person demonstrate humility? And if so, it's going to affect the whole culture. And if they don't, it's going to affect almost the whole culture. The exception to that is you will see pockets in the organization where a particular, say division manager or vice president has that style. And within his or her unit or organization, there is that healthier culture. Even in the desert of a larger organization that doesn't have it, but it's still going to reduce the performance of the larger organization if that person at the top doesn't. And part of the fun I had in working on the book was interviewing a dozen CEOs from pretty big brand organizations, places like Costco and Mayo Clinic and, Alan Mulally from Ford Motor Company, known for turning it around during the Great Recession. And these were leaders who had strong humility and created a culture in the organization where that was just the norm. And part of what they did was to make sure that the people they selected at the level below them and the levels below that also got this, also understood it. And then you have just a culture where that's dominant. Jim Sinegal, who was co-founder of Costco and chairman and CEO for many, many years, also was known for having a humble leadership style as he interacted with people around the company. And one of the things that was interesting was when he, many years later, decided it was finally time to retire, and they were anticipating Jelinek would become the next CEO, I heard a lot of people in the company saying, oh, that's going to be fine. We're not going to miss a beat because Craig has grown up in this company. He shares the same values, and Costco will continue as it always has. And indeed it did, Yeah. And so I think just creating that culture where this is how we deal with people. As Senegal said, we want a jerk-free culture. And he said, certainly we've made some mistakes, but when you find that you promoted someone who isn't getting it, you try to give that person the coaching and support to turn around. But if they're not getting it pretty quickly, you need to move them so that they, they're no longer hurting people, basically. And that's such a dignity thing that he's getting at when he says that.
Well, I know that we're part of Marshall's 100 coaches group, and I don't know if you've been doing the LPR that Marshall and Alan developed.
I did one, yeah.
Yeah, that system, and I think it's fascinating. I can see how in Alan's management, how if you come with all your reds every week or whatever, then pretty soon you find yourself gracious. I mean, in a nice way, it's time for you to move on. I mean, it was an interesting his explanation of how he used that tool to help manage the company. You in the book you talk about how bridging the divide between teams with different viewpoints. Can you talk about that and how you do that with dignity and humility?
Sure. And that's a challenge in most organizations. It's certainly a challenge in our larger society. And I think it has to go back to understanding what this issue of dignity is, and that we all have it. We all need a sense of self-worth. I talked a little bit about the backpack, so I'm going to digress here before I get straight to your answer, Rhett.
Right. But
we have as a society this belief that life is valuable. Our physical lives are valuable. And I don't think we have a lot of disagreement. Our laws support, we're not supposed to go kill people. And, we have things that support children to try to make sure they grow up healthy and that sort of thing. But the piece that we don't pay enough attention to, in my view, is the fact that however we got here, whatever our faith beliefs or non-faith beliefs are, it's pretty evident that we're different. We're unique. Every single person is unique. And that is also part of life. And so there's an inner person, and part of that is our psychology, and the piece I'm hitting at is this sense of self-worth. And healthy individuals need to feel that they have a sense of self-worth. Got a lot of research on what the downside is, say, of having low self-esteem, physical problems, psychological problems, etc. So it's important for people to have a good sense of who they are as a person. Now, it doesn't mean we think we can do everything. Some of us are better athletes than others or better students than others. But overall, this notion of dignity is that as a human being, I'm valuable, not just because I'm physically alive, but as a person. And if we could all get that, then I think it needs to affect how we behave with each other. And that gets back to your question of how do we deal when we have differences? And I think that means starting from a place of saying, hey, we can differ on opinions, we can disagree about policy, but we need to do that in a way that's mutually respectful. And when I talk about some of the leaders in the book who have this humble leadership style, they insist that people work together, and they insist that they do it in a respectful way. So let's bring the opposing teams together. Let's sit down. Let's set some norms for how we're going to have conversation. And then, my recommendation and approach is that you begin with, where are we in agreement? What's the larger goal that we all want? And it might be We want a healthy, happy society. It might be we want a company that's profitable and well regarded. And so, you go from there, and then you put the current challenge or problem in that context, and you begin to talk about what do we need to do in order to resolve it. And there will be differences of opinion. And then the question is, how do we work through that? But I think we have to come at it with an expectation that will compromise. Now, as a leader, one of the things I like to do is to give the broad parameters and then suggest to the group that they need to come up with a solution. And that kind of puts the responsibility on them to not just complain and impose, but come up with a solution for it. I was doing a webinar a week or so ago, and one of the participants described a situation in, this was actually Microsoft. Satya Nadella was not someone I interviewed for the book, but I wished I'd been able to get to him. But she said they had to make a decision, and there were 10 people involved, and 9 of them were for option A, and 1 person was for option B, and really resistant. And so they came to the meeting, and Sasha was there, and they explained the situation, and they clearly had 9 in favor. It would have been very easy to say, well, we have a majority, so let's just move on. And he didn't do that. She said what he did was to turn to the person who was opposed and say, what 3 things need to be true in order for you to support option A? What 3 things need to be true in order for you to support option A? And that puts the responsibility on the opposing person to think about it. And so that person then talked about what their concerns were and outlined what needed to happen. And then he turned to the others and said, what do you think about that? And pretty quickly they were able to say, okay, well, let's make this adjustment, that adjustment. And by the time they agreed with that, turned back to that 10th person, say, what do you think now? I'm all on board. And that's really a process for resolving these differences that supports other people's dignity and he showed so much humility in walking into that meeting and not saying, let's just go with what the 9 people want, but let's look at the person who's disagreeing and find out more about why. So I think that we need to help leaders have more of these skills in problem resolution, conflict resolution. We're migrating away from an era when leaders could simply do a top-down mandate and have it work. The nature of the work has changed in many places so that we do have to facilitate, collaborate, problem solve, and that type of thing. And many leaders need some support from people like you who do coaching or through organizational training in order to build those muscles to work with people, because it's about relationship.
What you said to me, telling that story, one of my major takeaways from that is that you can't just always take the expedient or the quick way out.
Right.
So you had 9 people that agreed, 1 person didn't. But if you steamroll them, like you said before, they're not going to feel like you've heard them. They're not going to feel like their concerns are addressed, and they're going to slowly pull away.
Absolutely.
That's only natural.
It's
a
natural
reaction.
Right.
And so that's really powerful. That's a really powerful lesson to take the time to resolve those, what you might consider little differences, or, if you've got a majority that thinks one way, the easy way is to go that direction and just steamroll everybody else and not listen. But that's a powerful lesson, I think. Yes.
It takes a little more time up front, but you end up with a much more engaged culture, community of people where everybody's dignity has been supported. People feel heard. And, the outcome could have been different. It's possible that after having that discussion, there wasn't a way to make the compromise. But I think even then, you have kept that person on board. They've had a chance to explain. They felt like the group at least made an attempt to try to well, could we do this? Well, no, we can't. What about this? No, we can't. So sometimes just hearing that sort of discussion helps people feel, well, at least I was listened to. I was heard. I didn't get what I wanted, but I'm okay with that.
And what I love is that that's good modeling for the rest of them in that room, right?
Yes.
To
Yes.
take back to the rest of their teams.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, because they should have been able to solve that on their own. Maybe that next time they could, right?
Maybe next time they can. They have a model for how to do it. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's my takeaway from that, which is really powerful. Are there any lessons here as my generation and your generation gets older and we start to retire? Are there any lessons in here in terms of managing? Because a lot of us now are managing millennials and Gen Z workforces. Are there any lessons here for managing those generations?
Yeah, you mean for our generation managing them, or for bringing them along?
Bringing them along and with humility and dignity, and using humility as a way to help manage those generations.
So I feel that on us, the older generation, it's important to respect their dignity as we're working with them, and they have an entirely different set of expectations than the generation before them. When I think of millennials and Gen Z, and it's interesting because having been in universities, college campuses forever, we started getting hit with this about a decade ago, a little longer than that, and seeing a newer generation come in that had been raised with technology and raised with a set of expectations that were very different than what we had. And I think within reason, we have learned to adapt to that, and now businesses are learning to adapt. So I think it's incumbent on every senior generation to make whatever adjustments have to be made to accommodate the fact that the younger one has its own way of doing things. I mean, we came through as boomers, and the world had to adjust to the fact that, we were different. We had different expectations. In terms of millennials and Gen Z and what they need to learn as they move in leadership, I don't think anybody has a corner on this humility market. I think they, in some ways, are ahead of the generation before them, and in some ways behind. So one of the ways they're ahead is that many of them have grown up with, for example, a much more diverse world. They have a greater mix of friends from an ethnic standpoint. Many have traveled. If nothing else, they've got the internet, so they've seen the world by internet. They're just really much more aware of and accommodating, in most cases, of those kinds of differences. So I think that that's an advantage, and many of us are still learning. Many of us are actually behind the curve on that. But on the other hand, and I started to see this on college campuses a decade ago, where you'd see pods of students walking across campus in little clusters of 3 to 10, shoulder to shoulder almost, but each of them on their phone texting. So they weren't talking with each other, they're talking to their devices, and they might have been texting each other for all I know. But the interpersonal interactions have, in the minds of many of the older generation, been reduced or lost. And so, and they've grown up in a culture that in some ways is much more comfortable simply being really flat out critical or directive in a sarcastic or snarky way. You can do that on social media. You can, be anonymous, or you can, use your name. But a lot of that kind of commentary doesn't work well in a workplace, and it particularly doesn't work well once you start to get power and you're in leadership. So for some in that generation, there's a need to grow and adapt in the interpersonal relationship piece, because that has been not as emphasized for their generation as it might have been, or it's been emphasized in a different way, the way they go about doing it. And so there's some sensitivities there that need to be developed to help many of them strengthen as leaders. But as I said, on the other hand, they get the piece about other people's dignity when it comes to some of the dimensions that older generations are struggling with.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating. I mean, I think the next few years is going to be fascinating as we come out of COVID and some of the lessons that we learned in COVID. I mean, humility probably being one of those as a leader. How do you do this in a workforce? I mean, it seems like to me it's going to be doubly hard, if that even makes sense, to do this. And some of us are going to be managing remote workforces from now on. And how do you display humility and dignity and self-awareness in a virtual context? It just seems like it's a little harder. I know that I'm better when I can see I sit in a room with somebody, I can see their real reaction because I'm reading those cues as we have conversation. I think it's harder online. I think it's harder via Zoom and to do that.
It is harder, and many things can be more hidden, because in the hour conversation you have with someone on Zoom, you may not realize as much about what they're dealing with their family. For example, the kids in the background or the next room trying to study, on their own computers on Zoom, or who's sick, or which family member is struggling with COVID, or is on the front lines working with COVID or whatever. So there are a lot of things that when you drop in and you have an hour a week or sometimes even less with a particular employee, you might not know that background. So I think a couple of things for leaders, because I do think you're right, Rhett, we will have some degree of remoteness probably carry forward. And I think the upside of that is that can help support people. We've found reduced commutes, people who have a chance to move farther out where housing might be more affordable. So there's some things that support dignity and happiness that way. But I think it makes it incumbent on leaders to intentionally check in with people. And that could be allocating an extra 20, 30 minutes in your, I don't know how often you would have staff meetings. Maybe it's not every meeting, but at some point to have an extra 20, 30 minutes on a regular basis to just do a check-in. How are we? Is anybody experiencing a need for help? And if it's something you're not comfortable sharing with the group, ping me, let me know, please. Let's have a sidebar about this. So I think that there are ways that leaders need to signal, I do see you, and I see you through the screen, and I'm not sitting down the hall. I'm not hearing the buzz in the hallway, but I do want to know what you need and how I can support you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's interesting times. I think we're, as work changes and leadership changes, we have to adapt as leaders. I think these are such critical skills, and I'm glad you wrote the book on it. This is it right here. Get your copy. Unfortunately, a lot of us can't go to bookstores right now, but you can get it on Amazon, I'm guessing. And
you can. It's available wherever books are sold, online and off.
Okay, well, it's called The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility, Dr. Marilyn Gist, and a guest chapter by Alan Mulally.
Yes.
And so go get your copy. It's a wonderful book and a wonderful read, and I think it's essential. It's an essential read for leaders right now, and I think it was just a very timely publication. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's great to have you on. Thank you for spending some time with us here on Power Lunch Live. We'll be back next week. We're going to be busy the rest of the week, but check out the schedule. We have our website. It's powerlunch.live. Powerlunch.live. It's right there on the screen. Go to it for the schedule, and we will see you next week. Have a great week.
Thank you.